Conversations about climate change can be hard. They can raise lots of difficult emotions, raise issues of science, uncertainty, and lead to conflict. So starting one isn't necessarily going to end with success. So what I wanted to talk with you about now for a few minutes is just how to run such a conversation in a way that hopefully both you and the person you're engaging with learn something from the conversation and take something away that's positive and possibly even lead to productive action on climate change. The key to a successful conversation is to open it in a way that builds trust. There are many opportunities to open conversations about climate change. It's in the zeitgeist. If it's a hot day, people say, well, it's climate change. If it's a cold day, they laugh and say there is no climate change. Of course, both of those points are not true. The weather and the climate are two different things, and they give you an opening to have a conversation about precisely what is the climate and how it's a long-run trend, and we need lots of information and data before we can discern a signal from that data of human impact on the climate. But the central key achievement in the early stages of any conversation about climate change is to build trust with the person you're engaging with and to build a sense of rapport and a delight in the conversation. The way you build trust is by being really honest about what you understand to be the truth. So there are many areas where people disagree on climate, and the reality is that while we know an awful lot, actually, and while there are thousands and thousands of papers and analyses done throughout the last few decades across all the world, there are still areas that are significantly uncertain. And a frequent area of dispute about climate change is that someone you're talking with will say, yes, but it's all uncertain. It's not certain that humans are causing climate change. It's not certain that climate change will be particularly bad. It's not certain that even if it is bad, we should do anything about it. It's not certain what we should do about it. It's not certain what other countries are doing about it, and that means that maybe we shouldn't do anything about it. So there's a whole sequence of essentially rebuttals to any kind of action on climate change, and there is a paper we've produced at the Smith School that sets out the most common of these rebuttals and provides references to the peer-reviewed literature as to how you might engage with those rebuttals. But a key element is to acknowledge the truth in some of those rebuttals. It isn't completely certain that climate change is going to be nasty. It seems highly likely, given what we know about tipping points in the climate system. It is almost certain that humans are causing climate change. How do we know this? Well, we know it because we can measure the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We can measure how much carbon dioxide traps heat. We know the carbon dioxide that's put in the atmosphere is put up there by us, and so on. So there's some very basic points that you can lose sight on in complex conversations about general atmospheric circulation models. The basic point is we're putting the CO2 up there and the other greenhouse gases. We know they trap heat. We know it's getting warmer, and it's getting warmer at the rate that you would expect given the gases that we put up there. So just settling some of those facts in a non-conflictual way, acknowledging uncertainties early on, can really build rapport and build trust with the person you're engaging with. So that's the first point, build trust. The second point is throughout the conversation, be open to the possibility that you might learn something. So don't seek to rebut everything that the other person's saying. Listen, pause, take it in, and engage with the truth. You might learn a truth. Hopefully you can share several truths of your own with the person you're engaging with. And making sure those truths hit home is absolutely vital. Now, it can be the case that in some of these conversations, conflict arises. Emotions can run high. How do you manage such situations? Well, the first thing is to try and avoid the emotion in the conversation that you don't want to be there. You may want emotion in the conversation, but probably what you don't want is anger or irritation or some of those other negative emotions, and you can probably tell when they're coming, because disagreements can blossom into much larger emotions if you don't quickly find a way of returning to agreement with your interlocutor. So managing those emotions is as much about returning to areas of agreement and highlighting those areas of agreement Now you might find that's difficult if you think, well, the person I'm engaging with doesn't know anything about this and what they've said is completely false and I just need to say that's rubbish. I understand that, but even in those circumstances there is normally a kernel of truth in what the other person is saying, and even if there isn't, it's very likely that you can rephrase what they're saying in a way that they would find acceptable that is truthful. So that is the art of these sorts of conversations. Rephrase, reframe, and try and keep things on both an agreeable path where you've got a lot of consensus and a truthful pathway. So they're central strategies for managing conflict and negative emotions. Now, if you think you've got far enough that you've got some rapport and you've got a relationship of trust, then it might be time in the conversation to turn to thinking about what action might be taken. You can't go there straight away. You need to build your way up to that kind of moment in a conversation. And if you've got there, rather than saying, I'd like you to do X, I want you to do Y, say, we've got this shared problem, you, me, and the rest of humanity. What can we do about the problem? Now, you don't want to get stuck here on, well, we should recycle more, or we should cycle our bikes. These are all good things. I'm not saying we shouldn't do them. But the point of having such conversations with business leaders, chief executives, leaders in finance and industry, is to, in a sense, use their positions of power to take action that is much more significant, has much more leveraged impact on the challenge. And the way to get somebody to take action, this is a general truth, not just about climate change, is to co-create an idea with them, not to tell them what to do, but to open up a space and a dialogue where you can say, well, what could your industry do? What could you do individually? Not just at home in your own behaviours, but how could you use your position of power to deliver change? And if you can start to generate a shared sense of problem solving, almost a team approach to the challenge, you're much more likely to get good ideas, ideas that you maybe hadn't thought of, and certainly ideas that your interlocutor is going to buy into because they're going to be theirs as well as yours. So that is the ideal. If you can't get there, at least not straight away, then by all means you can start to suggest things that possibly they could do. Not dictate, not even ask, but just suggest, what if we did this, what if we did that, would that work, why not? And your favourite idea that you think somebody should certainly do, and this chief executive should definitely do, just might not be very feasible at the current point in time. It's not always possible for people in positions of power to take leadership. Sometimes they're hemmed in by their surrounding political or business context. And while you do occasionally have great leadership that simply jumps outside the box, most of the time we're in those boxes. So it's about finding the room to maneuver within those spaces, those political spaces or those corporate spaces, and helping your interlocutor realize that maybe the room to maneuver is actually a bit bigger than they might perceive it to be. So for instance, in many instances, take a fund manager. They're thinking, well, I'd love to do something about climate change, but what can I do? Well, actually, there are a lot of different products now, and more products coming onto the financial markets that reduce carbon footprint, that redirect capital in the right sorts of directions. Now, a fund manager might think, yes, well, I'd love to do that, but I can't afford to take a hit on my performance. But have they actually looked at the performance of some of those funds and financial products? In many instances, they're actually superior to the performance of conventional instruments or dirty instruments. And on top of that, even if their performance is just the same today, it seems fairly likely that the risk of such investments is considerably lower. I mean, we're about to have a once in a civilization transformation of a bunch of systems, the energy system, the agricultural system. Huge value is going to be destroyed. It already has been destroyed in some markets. You can point to the savaging of the market capitalization of European energy utilities over the last decade as what can happen if you're not on top of these risks. So it's not just hypothetical, it's already real, and it's going to get worse. So you need to, you, business leader or finance leader, needs to be aware of the changes that are underway in the physical climate, and then how they're going to affect policy and industry and risk throughout multiple supply chains. So to go back to the point, the political space and the business room for maneuver is actually often larger than people perceive it to be. And a huge contribution you can make is helping those in power to realize that actually they can take a leadership position without damage to their own personal interest or career prospects or reputation. In fact, possibly with a benefit, a big benefit to their interests. And if you can get that far, you've really achieved an awful lot. Now, two last things. First, in these conversations, as I said before, you don't want too many negative and conflicting emotions to emerge, and if they do emerge, you really want to row back a bit and get yourself to a point where you can return to happy engagement, collective problem solving, and so on. However, there's one instance where appeals to emotion, or at least certainly fairness, concepts of justice or equity, can actually work rather well. Very often it is people my age and older who have been effectively causing this problem, and it's often people in their 20s or younger who are going to be bearing the brunt of the impacts in rich and in poor countries alike. It is not unreasonable, without doing it in a nasty or a dogmatic way, to just simply point out that fact. We need leadership from the current generation of leaders, because otherwise their legacy will be to leave an economic system and indeed a planet that is, if not uninhabitable, then delivering a much lower levels of prosperity for people around the world than they've had themselves. Most people actually want to leave the world a better place. And so if you can make the point that they're at risk of being the first generation ever in human history to leave the world a worse place than it was when they inherited it, I think it's hard not to be affected by such an appeal to fairness. You know, this is fundamentally unfair. You are at risk, your generation, of failing in your duty as trustees and stewards of the earth. But I think you have to be careful with how you use those emotional appeals. So, to sum up, you want to engage with these conversations with a bit of preparation so that you know the facts. Focus on building rapport and trust with your interlocutor early. Validate the things they're saying wherever you can, but provided it's truthful. And truth should be a thread that runs throughout the conversation, because that's how you build credibility with the person you're talking to. And if you can make it lighthearted and fun, all the better. Then once you've built that credibility and that rapport, you can start to team problem solve on the actions that might be possible for the person you're talking with, person in power. And if that isn't very productive, then you can start to possibly suggest some actions that they might take. You can manage conflict by just being aware of the body language, the emotion, the irritation that is emerging, roll back, seek to return to areas of consensus before pushing forwards again. And then finally, judiciously and carefully, you can appeal to fairness, just to make sure the point really gets home, that this is important to you, and actually probably to all of your friends and to your entire generation. So I hope that's helpful.